Don't touch him. The words tore out of Emily Carter's throat before she even realized she was speaking, her arms tightening instinctively around her son as the fluorescent lights above flickered with a cold, sterile hum, casting pale shadows across the emergency room walls where every second felt too loud and too slow at the same time. Noah's small fingers clutched the fabric of her worn sweater, his breathing uneven but steady enough to keep her hope alive. And she could feel the heat of his forehead against her collarbone, as if the entire world had narrowed down to that single fragile point of contact, the only thing that mattered in a place that smelled like antiseptic and quiet judgment. A nurse nearby glanced over with practiced indifference, her clipboard held like a shield between empathy and protocol, while the distant beeping of machines created a rhythm that pressed against Emily's chest, reminding her how close everything always was to falling apart. She hadn't slept in nearly 36 hours, not since Noah's fever spiked past 102 and refused to come down, not since she counted the last crumpled bills in her wallet and realized they wouldn't even cover the initial consultation fee, let alone the tests the doctor said he might need. Her mind replayed the same question over and over. How do you protect your child when you can't even afford to be here? But she refused to let it show. Refused to let anyone see the fear that threatened to break through her composure. The automatic doors slid open behind her with a soft hiss, and the subtle shift in the room was almost immediate, conversations lowering, footsteps slowing, a quiet ripple of attention moving like a shadow across the polished floor. Emily didn't turn at first, too focused on Noah's breathing, too determined to hold on to the fragile control she still had, but then she felt it, a presence, calm and deliberate, stopping just within arm's reach. When she finally looked up, she saw him, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked untouched by the chaos of the world around him, his steel blue eyes fixed not on her, but on Noah. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, not hurried, not uncertain, as if he belonged exactly where he was, even in a place filled with urgency and fear. Emily's heart tightened, instinct flaring before logic could catch up, and when his hand moved slightly forward, not even touching, just reaching as if drawn by something invisible, she reacted without hesitation. Don't touch him, she repeated, louder this time, her voice trembling but unyielding, drawing a few curious glances from across the room. The man didn't flinch, didn't withdraw, his gaze remaining steady as if her words had only confirmed something he already knew. There was no anger in his expression, no offense, only a quiet certainty that felt heavier than any accusation. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause, the distant sounds fading into a dull echo as Emily tightened her hold on Noah, her pulse racing against her ribs. Then, in a voice low enough that it didn't need to be loud to be heard, he spoke, each word measured, unwavering. He's mine. The sentence landed with a weight that didn't make sense, not here, not now, not in a life where Emily had carried every burden alone for the past 5 years, where no one had ever stepped forward to claim responsibility, let alone something as impossible as this. Her mind rejected it instantly, her grip on Noah tightening as if the very idea could pull him away, but something in the man's eyes, something she couldn't name, made it impossible to dismiss completely. The nurse shifted awkwardly nearby, sensing tension she didn't understand, while a monitor beeped steadily in the background, grounding the moment in reality even as everything else felt like it was slipping out of place. Emily shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper now but filled with defiance. You don't know us, she said, though the certainty she tried to hold on to felt thinner with every passing second. The man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, only glanced once more at Noah before meeting her gaze fully, and in that silent exchange something unspoken passed between them, something that didn't belong to the present moment, but lingered just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, as if the past had finally caught up with both of them in the most unexpected place imaginable. Emily felt the words echo long after he said them, as if they had settled into the air and refused to leave, her heartbeat loud in her ears while Noah shifted slightly in her arms, his small hand still gripping her sweater like an anchor. She forced herself to steady her breathing, to hold on to something real, because nothing about what this man had just said made sense, not in her life. Not in the story she had been living for the past 5 years where every responsibility had fallen on her shoulders alone. The man did not step closer again, but he did not leave either, his presence calm and unshaken, like he had already decided something that she had not yet been allowed to understand. Emily adjusted Noah gently, brushing a strand of hair away from his damp forehead, trying to focus on the warmth of her son instead of the weight of the stranger's gaze. But it was impossible to ignore the way he was looking at Noah, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with something deeper. Something that made her chest tighten in a way she did not like. "You need to go," she said quietly, her voice controlled now, protective rather than panicked. "We are waiting for a doctor." But even as she spoke, she could feel how thin her authority sounded in a place where money decided who got attention and who had to wait. The man nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging her words without accepting them, and then he spoke again, his tone even, almost careful. "What is his name?" And the question felt too personal, too immediate, as if he had skipped every boundary that should have existed between strangers. Emily hesitated, her instinct telling her not to answer, but something about the moment, the exhaustion, the quiet intensity in his voice, made the truth slip out before she could stop it. "Noah," she said, and the way the man repeated it under his breath, almost like a memory instead of a name, sent a ripple of unease through her. A nurse approached then, clipboard in hand, her expression polite but distant. "Miss Carter, we are still waiting on the pediatric specialist. It may be another hour." And Emily nodded, swallowing the frustration that rose in her throat, because an hour felt like forever when your child was not well and you had no control over the timeline. Before she could respond, the man beside her spoke quietly to the nurse, his voice low enough that it did not draw attention but firm enough that it carried authority. "He should not be waiting." And the nurse's posture shifted almost instantly, her professional distance replaced by a flicker of recognition. Her eyes moving from his face to the subtle details she might have missed at first glance, the tailored suit, the watch, the quiet confidence that did not need introduction. "Sir," she said carefully, her tone softening, "we are doing our best with the current schedule." But there was already a change in her demeanor, a readiness to respond differently than she had seconds before. Emily felt it immediately, the invisible line between those who could demand and those who had to ask, and it made something inside her tighten with quiet resistance. "We will wait," she said firmly, before the man could speak again, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. "We have been waiting this long." And for the first time, the man looked at her fully, not past her, not through her, but at her, as if reassessing something he had assumed. There was no irritation in his expression, no dismissal, only a quiet observation, like he was trying to understand why she would refuse help when it was right in front of her. "You should not have to," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, something softer, almost careful, as if he was stepping into unfamiliar territory. Emily shook her head slightly, her grip on Noah tightening just enough to remind herself why she was here. "We manage," she replied, the words simple but carrying years of struggle behind them, years of making impossible choices and finding a way forward anyway. The man studied her for a moment longer, then reached into his jacket pocket, not hurried, not dramatic, and pulled out his phone, typing a short message before slipping it back. And though he did not explain, the effect was immediate, the nurse stepping away quickly, speaking to someone near the desk, and within seconds, the quiet rhythm of the waiting room shifted again, this time in a way Emily could not ignore. She felt the change before she saw it, the subtle urgency, the whispered conversations, the sudden attention directed toward her and Noah, and her stomach tightened with a mix of relief and discomfort because she knew exactly what it meant. Even if she did not want to admit it, when the nurse returned, her tone had completely changed. Warm and attentive in a way it had not been before. "Miss Carter, we are ready to take Noah in now." And Emily froze for just a second, caught between gratitude and the unsettling realization that this had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with the man still standing beside her. She looked at him again, really looked this time, and the question that had been forming since the moment he walked in finally surfaced, quiet but undeniable. "Who are you?" And the man held her gaze. Without hesitation, his answer simple, unadorned, yet carrying a weight that explained everything and nothing all at once. "Alexander Hayes." The name lingered in Emily's mind longer than it should have, not because she recognized it immediately, but because of the way the room reacted to it, the subtle shift in posture from the nurse, the quick glance from the receptionist, the quiet urgency that followed him like an invisible current. She had heard the name before, maybe on the news playing in the background at the diner where she worked late shifts. Maybe in passing conversations she never had time to follow, but it did not belong in her world, not here. Not standing a few feet away while her son rested against her shoulder. She swallowed the thought and focused on Noah as the nurse gently guided them down the hallway, her hand hovering near Emily's elbow in a way that felt both helpful and unfamiliar, like a courtesy reserved for someone else. The hallway lights were softer, the air quieter, and the steady hum of machines replaced the restless noise of the waiting room, giving the moment a strange calm that made everything feel more real. Emily laid Noah carefully on the examination bed, smoothing his hair back again as if the simple motion could protect him from everything she could not control, and for a brief second she allowed herself to breathe, to believe that maybe being seen this quickly might make a difference. She did not look back right away, but she knew Alexander Hayes had followed, his presence lingering near the doorway, not intrusive, not demanding, just there. As if he had decided he was not leaving, the doctor entered moments later, a calm woman in her mid-40s with kind but focused eyes, introducing herself as Dr. Reynolds, her tone professional but warmer than what Emily had experienced before, already reviewing Noah's chart as if time mattered more now. "We are going to run a few tests to understand what is causing the fever," she explained, her voice steady, and Emily nodded, holding on to every word like it was something she could build certainty from. Noah stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to find hers, and she smiled softly, brushing her thumb along his cheek, whispering that everything was going to be okay even though she could not guarantee it. When the nurse gently asked her to step aside so they could begin, Emily hesitated for just a second before letting go, her hands lingering a moment longer than necessary. As if releasing him even briefly felt wrong, she stepped back, folding her arms close to her body. And that was when she noticed it again, the way Alexander was watching, not the equipment, not the doctor, but Noah, his attention unwavering in a way that felt too personal to ignore. "You should wait outside," Emily said quietly, her voice controlled but firm, not wanting to cause a scene yet unwilling to allow him space he had not earned. He did not move immediately, his gaze still fixed on Noah as the doctor worked, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more measured than before. "I am not here to take him." And the statement, simple as it was, landed differently now, not as a claim, but as something closer to a promise he had not yet explained. Emily frowned slightly, her exhaustion making it harder to separate instinct from reason. "Then why are you here?" she asked, the question softer but no less direct, and for a moment, Alexander did not answer right away, as if the truth required more than a quick response. He glanced at her then, really looked at her again, and something in his expression shifted, not certainty this time, but recognition struggling to surface, like a memory just out of reach. "Because I think I should have been here a long time ago," he said finally, and the words made no sense, not in a timeline where Emily had faced every hospital visit, every late night, every quiet fear alone, but something about the way he said it, without arrogance, without assumption, made it impossible to dismiss entirely. Emily shook her head slightly, her defenses rising again. "You do not even know us," she replied, though the conviction behind her words felt less solid than before, and Alexander did not argue, did not push, only shifted his attention back to Noah as the doctor adjusted the monitor and noted something quietly to the nurse. The room filled with the soft sounds of medical equipment, steady and controlled, and Emily stood there caught between two realities, the one she had lived for years and the one that seemed to be unfolding in front of her without permission, wondering how a stranger could walk into her life and speak like he had always been part of it, and why, despite everything, a small, unsettling part of her felt like he might not be entirely wrong. The soft beeping of the monitor filled the space between them, steady and precise, a rhythm that should have been comforting but only seemed to make Emily more aware of how fragile everything still was. She watched every movement the doctor made, every adjustment, every note written down, trying to read meaning in details she did not fully understand, because not knowing had always been the hardest part, the space where fear quietly grew. Noah lay still, his small chest rising and falling in a way that felt too slow for her comfort, and she found herself counting each breath without realizing it, as if her attention alone could keep him steady. Dr. Reynolds glanced at the screen again, her expression thoughtful but not alarmed, and that alone allowed Emily to hold on to a thread of hope, something small but necessary. "His vitals are stable," the doctor said calmly, her voice measured in a way that carried reassurance without overpromising. "But I would like to run a few additional tests to rule out anything more serious." And Emily nodded quickly, relief mixing with lingering anxiety, because stable did not mean safe, not yet. She shifted her weight slightly, her body still tense, her eyes never leaving Noah for more than a second. And it was only when she felt that familiar presence again that she remembered she was not alone in the room. Alexander had not moved much, but something about him had changed, not in posture, but in focus, as if every detail the doctor mentioned was being quietly stored, processed, understood in a way that went beyond concern. When Dr. Reynolds mentioned a specific test, a more advanced one that Emily knew would cost more than she could even think about, she felt her stomach tighten, her mind already racing ahead to numbers, to bills, to impossible choices she had made too many times before. "Is that necessary right now?" Emily asked carefully, her voice steady but edged with something she could not hide, and the doctor hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "It would give us a clearer picture," she said, choosing her words with care. "But we could prioritize based on your situation." And that was all it took, that small shift, that quiet acknowledgement of limitation, to remind Emily exactly where she stood. Before she could respond, before she could decide what she could afford to risk and what she could not, Alexander spoke again, his voice calm but firm in a way that carried across the room without raising in volume. "Run everything you need." And Emily turned sharply toward him, her eyes flashing with something stronger than frustration, something closer to refusal. "You do not get to decide that," she said immediately, her tone low but unwavering, because this was not something she could let go, not control, not even a little. Alexander met her gaze without resistance, but also without stepping back, as if he expected the reaction, as if he understood it without needing it explained. "I am not deciding for you," he replied evenly. "I am removing the reason you would have to say no." And the words landed differently than she expected, not forceful, not dismissive, but steady, like he was offering something without taking anything in return. Emily shook her head slightly, her grip tightening at her sides. "We do not need charity," she said, though the sentence felt heavier than the truth behind it, because what they needed and what they could accept had never been the same thing. The room fell quiet for a moment, the doctor pausing just long enough to recognize that something more than medical decisions was unfolding, and Alexander did not rush to respond, did not push, only looked at Noah again before speaking, softer this time. "This is not charity," he said, and for the first time since he had entered the room, there was something else in his voice, something less certain, something closer to personal. "It is responsibility." And the word hung there, heavier than anything he had said before, shifting the weight of the conversation in a way Emily could not immediately counter, because responsibility implied something deeper, something that reached beyond money, beyond presence, into a space she had never allowed anyone else to enter. Emily's breath caught slightly, her mind resisting the implication even as her instincts struggled to deny it. And she looked back at Noah, at the small boy who had been her entire world for 5 years, wondering how a single word from a stranger could begin to unravel something she had worked so hard to hold together. Emily did not respond right away, because there was nothing simple left to say, her thoughts moving too fast, colliding with memories she had buried so deeply that they no longer felt like part of her present life. Responsibility, he had said, and the word echoed in a place she had kept sealed for years, a place tied to a night she rarely allowed herself to revisit, not because it was painful in the way most people expected, but because it was unfinished, unanswered, something that had never been meant to carry consequences beyond a single moment. She turned her attention back to Noah, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his small hand resting near his side, and she reminded herself of what mattered, what had always mattered, that she had raised him alone, protected him alone, loved him enough to make up for everything he did not have. "We will decide what is necessary," she said finally, her voice quieter now but still firm, not rejecting the help entirely, but refusing to surrender control. "And Dr. Reynolds gave a small, understanding nod, stepping back slightly to give her space while still preparing the next steps. Alexander did not argue, which unsettled Emily more than if he had, because there was no pressure, no insistence, only a quiet patience that suggested he believed time would bring the answer he was waiting for. The nurse adjusted a sensor on Noah's arm, the soft adhesive pressing against his skin. And he stirred again, his eyes fluttering open just enough to search the room. Before settling on Emily, and in that instant, everything else faded for her, every question, every doubt, replaced by the simple need to be there for him. "I am here," she whispered softly, leaning closer, brushing her fingers gently across his forehead, and Noah's grip tightened slightly, as if he understood more than he could say, as if her presence alone was enough to keep him anchored. Alexander watched that moment in silence, something shifting behind his steady expression, something quieter now, less certain, as if what he was witnessing did not fit into the assumptions he had walked in with. After a few seconds, Noah's eyes drifted closed again, his breathing evening out just enough to ease the tension in Emily's chest, and she exhaled slowly, not realizing how tightly she had been holding herself together until that moment. The doctor stepped forward again, her tone gentle but focused. "We will begin with the initial tests and monitor his response before moving forward," she said, offering a path that balanced urgency with consideration, and Emily nodded, grateful for the compromise even if it did not remove the weight entirely, as the nurse began preparing to move Noah to another room for testing. Emily instinctively reached for him again, her hand resting lightly against his arm, unwilling to let the connection break completely, even for a moment. "I will come with him," she said, more to herself than anyone else, and the nurse gave a reassuring smile. "Of course," she replied, already adjusting the bed to make it easier to move. Emily glanced once more toward Alexander, her expression guarded but no longer as sharp, because something had changed, not trust, not acceptance, but a shift she could not fully explain, a recognition that his presence was no longer something she could simply dismiss. "You should not be here," she said quietly, not as a command this time, but as a statement she was trying to convince herself of, and Alexander held her gaze for a moment before responding, his voice lower, more measured than before. "That is not what this feels like." And there was no arrogance in the way he said it, no attempt to assert himself, only a quiet honesty that made it harder to argue against. Emily looked away first, her attention returning to Noah as the bed was gently moved, the wheels rolling softly against the polished floor, and she walked beside him, one hand resting near his shoulder, unwilling to lose that contact even as they moved. Alexander followed at a distance, not interfering, not stepping ahead, simply present, and as they moved down the hallway, Emily could not shake the feeling that something had already begun to shift, something she had spent years building walls against, and now, without warning, without permission, those walls were beginning to crack in ways she did not yet understand, leaving her caught between the life she had known and a truth that had not fully revealed itself yet, but was getting closer with every step forward. The hallway seemed longer this time, quieter, as if every step echoed more than it should, the soft rolling of the hospital bed blending with the distant hum of machines and muted voices behind closed doors, and Emily kept her hand close to Noah, not gripping, not restraining, just there, a constant point of contact that reassured both of them without needing words. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow across his face, making him look smaller than he was, more fragile than she ever allowed herself to believe, and she found herself leaning in slightly as they moved, watching every subtle rise and fall of his chest as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the moment. The nurse guided them into a diagnostic room, the space colder, more clinical, filled with equipment that carried a quiet authority Emily had learned to both depend on and fear, and as the bed came to a stop, she stepped closer immediately, her presence instinctive, protective, unyielding. "We will start with a basic scan," the nurse explained gently, her tone practiced but softer now, as if the urgency of earlier had shifted into something more deliberate, and Emily nodded, though her attention remained fixed on Noah, on the way his small fingers twitched slightly as if reacting to something only he could feel. Alexander remained near the doorway again, not intruding, but not leaving either, his posture composed, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but quietly held it. Emily could feel him there even without looking, the awareness settling at the edge of her thoughts, persistent and difficult to ignore. As the technician prepared the equipment, adjusting settings and placing items carefully within reach, Emily felt the familiar tension rise again. The silent calculation of what each step might cost, what each decision might lead to, and she pressed her lips together, reminding herself that she had navigated worse, that she had always found a way. "You can stay with him," the technician said, offering her a position beside the bed, and Emily moved without hesitation, her hand finding Noah's again, her thumb brushing lightly across his knuckles in a rhythm she had repeated countless times before, a quiet reassurance she hoped he could feel even now. For a moment, everything settled into a fragile stillness, the kind that existed just before something changed, and Emily allowed herself to breathe, slow and controlled, focusing only on the present, on the simple act of being there. Then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, approaching quickly, purposeful, and the shift in the air that followed, subtle but unmistakable, and she turned slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to catch the movement at the doorway. A woman stepped in, her presence polished and precise, dressed in a tailored navy suit that spoke of authority without needing introduction, her expression composed but alert as her gaze moved directly to Alexander. "Mr. Hayes?" she said quietly, her tone respectful but urgent, and for the first time since he had arrived, Alexander's attention broke from Noah, shifting toward her with a focus that suggested familiarity, not surprise. Emily watched the exchange without fully understanding it, but she recognized the dynamic immediately, the way the woman waited for his response, the way the room seemed to hold its breath just a little longer. "Not now," Alexander replied, his voice low but firm, and the woman hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly toward Emily and Noah before returning to him, as if reassessing the situation in a matter of seconds. "It concerns your schedule," she added carefully, and there was something in her tone that suggested importance, something that would normally take priority. But Alexander did not shift, did not step away, his gaze returning to Noah almost immediately. "Then it can wait," he said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation, because it was not just a delay, it was a choice. Emily felt that choice more than she understood it, the quiet decision to stay, to remain present in a moment that had nothing to do with his world and everything to do with hers, and it unsettled her in a way she could not easily explain. The woman nodded once, professionally, stepping back without argument, but the brief interruption left a ripple behind, a reminder that Alexander belonged to something larger, something structured and controlled. A world where time was measured differently. As the door closed softly behind her, the room returned to its previous stillness, but it felt different now, heavier with unspoken meaning. Emily looked at Noah again, then finally allowed her gaze to shift toward Alexander, studying him with a new kind of focus, not just as a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, but as someone who had chosen to stay when he did not have to, and that choice, quiet as it was, began to change the way she saw everything that had happened since he walked into the room, leaving her with a question she had not yet found the courage to ask, but could no longer ignore. The machine let out a soft, steady hum as the skin began, a low vibration that filled the quiet room with a mechanical rhythm, and Emily stood close enough to feel the faint tremor through the edge of the bed, her hand still resting lightly against Noah's arm as if that single point of contact could ground both of them through whatever came next. She watched the technician's screen without truly understanding what she was seeing. Shadows and shapes shifting in silent patterns that held answers she could not read, and it made her feel smaller than she wanted to admit, like she was standing at the edge of something important without the ability to step fully into it. Noah remained still, his breathing more even now, his small face relaxed in a way that gave her just enough comfort to hold on to, and she found herself memorizing that expression, as if she needed to capture every detail in case something changed. The room stayed quiet except for the machine and the occasional soft instruction from the technician, and in that quiet, Emily became aware again of the presence behind her, steady and patient, not moving, not interrupting, but undeniably there. She turned slightly, just enough to meet Alexander's gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away immediately, because there was something she needed to understand, something she could no longer push aside. "Why did you say that?" she asked quietly, her voice low enough not to disturb the moment but firm enough that it carried weight, and Alexander did not pretend not to know what she meant, his expression steady as he stepped a little closer, still keeping distance from the bed itself. "Because I meant it," he replied simply, and the answer, though expected, only deepened the question rather than resolving it. Emily frowned slightly, her hand tightening just a fraction against Noah's sleeve. "You cannot just walk in here and say something like that," she said, the edge returning to her voice, not out of anger alone but out of fear, because words like that had consequences, and she had spent years protecting her son from anything that might disrupt the life she had built. Alexander's gaze shifted briefly to Noah, then back to her, and there was something different in it now, not certainty, not yet, but something closer to recognition, like he was piecing together fragments that had never been meant to connect. "How old is he?" he asked, and the question landed heavier than it should have, because it was not casual, not idle, it was deliberate. Emily hesitated for a second, her instinct telling her to shut the conversation down, to refuse any information that could give him ground, but exhaustion and something else she could not name made her answer anyway. 5, she said, her voice quieter now. Alexander nodded once, almost to himself, his jaw tightening slightly as if confirming something internal, and Emily felt the shift immediately, the subtle change in his posture, in his focus, like a calculation had just settled into place. 5 years, he repeated under his breath, and then his eyes lifted to meet hers again, more intent now, more certain than before. "Where were you 6 years ago?" And the question struck her like a sudden drop in temperature, unexpected and sharp enough to steal her breath for just a moment. Emily's mind resisted immediately, pushing back against the direction of the conversation, because there were places she did not go anymore, memories she had chosen to leave behind because they did not belong in the life she had created for herself and Noah. "That is not your business," she said quickly, her voice firmer now, defensive in a way that made the technician glance up briefly before returning to the screen. Alexander did not push harder, did not demand an answer, but he did not step back either, his presence steady as ever. "It might be," he said quietly, and there was no accusation in his tone, no force, only a quiet persistence that made it harder to ignore. Emily shook her head, her focus snapping back to Noah as if that alone could anchor her again. "No, it is not," she replied, softer now but no less certain, because whatever he thought he was connecting, whatever conclusion he was beginning to form, she could not allow it to take shape without understanding what it would mean. The machine continued its steady hum, the technician noting something quietly before adjusting a setting, and the moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and answers that neither of them was ready to fully confront. Emily felt it then, not just fear, not just confusion, but the unsettling realization that the past she had carefully set aside was no longer as distant as she had believed, and that the man standing a few feet away was somehow connected to it in a way that was becoming harder to deny, leaving her caught between protecting the life she had built and facing a truth that was slowly, quietly making its way to the surface whether she was ready for it or not. The question did not disappear after she refused to answer it, it stayed there, quiet but persistent, like something waiting just beneath the surface, and Emily could feel it pressing against her thoughts even as she forced her attention back to Noah, to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the soft hum of the machine that continued its work. She focused on the present, on what she could control. Because the past had never given her anything except uncertainty, and she had learned long ago that survival meant moving forward, not looking back. The technician adjusted the final setting and stepped slightly away, her eyes scanning the monitor with careful concentration, and after a moment she nodded once, signaling that the scan was complete. We will have preliminary results shortly," she said gently, her voice measured, and Emily let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders easing just a fraction. The machine powered down with a soft click, and the room seemed quieter without its constant hum, leaving space for everything else to return: the questions, the tension, the presence of the man who had not left. Emily reached for Noah again as the technician carefully repositioned him, her fingers brushing lightly across his arm, and this time, his eyes opened a little wider, clearer, as if the rest had steadied him. "Mom," he murmured softly, his voice small but present, and Emily leaned in immediately, her expression softening in a way it only ever did for him. "I am here," she whispered, her voice warm and steady despite everything else, and Noah's gaze shifted slightly, moving past her shoulder for just a second before returning, his small brow furrowing as if something unfamiliar had caught his attention. Emily followed that glance instinctively, turning just enough to see Alexander standing there, still, watching, and for a moment, something passed between them that she could not explain, not a recognition exactly, but a quiet curiosity that made her chest tighten. "Who is that?" Noah asked faintly, his voice barely above a whisper, and the simplicity of the question hit Emily harder than anything else had, because there was no prepared answer, no safe explanation she could offer that would keep everything contained the way she needed it to be. She hesitated, just for a second, long enough for the silence to stretch, and before she could respond, Alexander stepped slightly closer, not too close, not crossing the invisible boundary she had set, but enough that his presence was no longer distant. "I am a friend," he said gently, his voice softer now, different from before, as if he had chosen each word carefully. And Noah studied him for a moment, his small expression thoughtful in a way that felt older than his years. "You look familiar," Noah said quietly, and Emily's breath caught without warning, her fingers tightening just slightly against the edge of the bed. Because children noticed things adults tried to ignore, they saw connections that did not rely on logic or explanation. Alexander did not respond immediately, but something shifted in his expression again, something deeper, something that did not belong to assumption anymore but to something closer to certainty. And Emily felt it, that change, that movement from question to belief, and it made her heart beat faster in a way she could not control. "We have never met," Emily said quickly, her voice steadier than she felt, trying to close the space that had opened, trying to bring everything back under control before it moved any further. But Noah did not look convinced, his gaze still lingering on Alexander as if searching for something he could not name. The door opened quietly then, breaking the moment, and Dr. Reynolds stepped back in, her expression focused but calm, holding a tablet in her hand as she approached the bed. "I have the initial results," she said, her voice bringing the room back to its original purpose, and Emily turned immediately, her full attention returning to the one thing that mattered most. But even as she did, she could still feel it, the shift that had just taken place, the subtle but undeniable change that had begun to connect pieces she had kept separate for years. And as she waited for the doctor to speak, she realized that whatever came next would not just be about Noah's condition, it would also bring her closer to a truth she had spent years avoiding, a truth that was no longer willing to stay hidden now that it had finally been seen. Dr. Reynolds did not rush as she stepped closer to the bed, her presence calm and grounded in a way that steadied the room without needing to say it out loud, and Emily felt herself hold still, her attention narrowing completely to the tablet in the doctor's hands, to the expression on her face, searching for any sign that might tell her what was coming before the words arrived. Noah's fingers curled slightly against the thin hospital blanket, his eyes half open now, drifting between awareness and rest, and Emily placed her hand gently over his, her thumb moving in a slow, reassuring rhythm as if anchoring him to her presence while she braced herself for whatever came next. "The initials can show some inflammation," Dr. Reynolds began, her tone measured, careful. "But it does not indicate anything immediately critical." And the words landed like a breath Emily had been holding for hours, her shoulders lowering just enough to release some of the tension that had been building since the moment they walked into the hospital. Relief came first, sharp and immediate, but it did not last long, because she knew enough to understand that not critical did not mean resolved, not yet. We will need to run further tests to understand the cause and make sure there is nothing underlying. The doctor continued, her eyes meeting Emily's with quiet reassurance. But for now, he is stable. And Emily nodded quickly, her throat tightening as she whispered, "Thank you?" Because in that moment, stable felt like everything beside her. She could feel the shift again, the quiet awareness of Alexander listening, processing every word with the same focus he had shown since he arrived, and she did not need to look to know that he was still there, still watching, still part of something she had not yet agreed to. "Can I stay with him?" Emily asked softly, her voice steady now, grounded in the one thing she knew she could control, and Dr. Reynolds nodded without hesitation. "Of course," she replied, offering a small, reassuring smile before stepping slightly aside to speak quietly with the nurse. The room settled into a softer silence, the urgency easing just enough to let the moment breathe, and Emily leaned closer to Noah, brushing her fingers gently through his hair, her voice low and warm as she whispered that everything was going to be okay, even though she knew the path ahead was still uncertain. Noah shifted slightly under her touch, his eyes opening again. Clearer now, and for a moment he simply looked at her. His small expression calm in a way that made her chest ache with quiet love, and then, slowly, his gaze moved again, drifting past her shoulder toward the same place it had before. Emily followed it this time without hesitation, her eyes finding Alexander where he stood, still and composed, but no longer distant, and there was something different in the way he looked back now, something that was no longer just curiosity or assumption, but something deeper, something that felt closer to recognition than either of them was ready to say out loud. "Are you staying?" Noah asked softly, his voice still faint but clearer than before, and the question hung in the air, simple and direct in a way that adults often avoided, and Emily felt it immediately, the weight of it, the way it pulled everything into focus. She opened her mouth to answer, to redirect, to protect, but before she could, Alexander spoke, his voice quieter than it had been all day, steady but careful. "If it is okay with your mom," he said, his gaze shifting briefly to Emily, not asking permission with words, but offering her the space to decide. Emily held that look for a moment, longer than she intended, because something in the way he said it, the lack of assumption, the absence of control, made it harder to reject outright, and she felt the familiar tension rise again, the instinct to push him away clashing with something new, something uncertain that she did not yet understand. She looked back at Noah, at the small boy who had always been her whole world. And she realized that the question was no longer just about a stranger in a hospital room. It was about something larger, something that had begun to take shape whether she was ready or not. "For a little while," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear, and Noah gave a small nod, as if that answer was enough, his eyes drifting closed again as the room settled into a softer stillness. Emily remained where she was, her hand still resting over Noah's, but her awareness stretched beyond that now, beyond the moment she had always controlled, because for the first time, she had allowed someone else to remain, not because she trusted him, not because she understood him, but because something inside her had begun to shift, and she could no longer pretend that his presence did not matter, not when it was starting to change everything around her in ways she could not yet predict. The room grew quieter after Noah's breathing settled into a steady rhythm, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but full, as if everything unsaid was still present, waiting just beneath the surface. And Emily remained beside him, her hand resting lightly over his, her thumb moving in that same slow pattern she had used since he was a baby, a rhythm that had carried them through nights of fever, through moments of fear, through every time she had needed to be strong when she felt anything but. She could feel Alexander's presence without looking, steady and patient, not shifting, not interrupting, as if he understood that this moment belonged to her and Noah first, and that anything else would have to wait. But waiting did not mean disappearing, and the awareness of him lingered at the edge of her thoughts, persistent in a way that made it impossible to return to the life she had been living just hours ago. She exhaled slowly, her gaze still on Noah, but her mind no longer able to ignore the question that had been building since he asked it, since he said 5 years, like it meant something more than time. And before she could stop herself, she spoke, her voice quiet but deliberate. 6 years ago, I was in Seattle. And the words felt heavier once they were out, like something she had not planned to share had slipped through anyway. There was a pause behind her, not long, but enough that she felt it, and when she finally turned, she saw the change immediately, the way Alexander's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that it confirmed something had just aligned in his mind. Late October, he said, not asking, but stating it in a tone that made it clear he was not guessing, and Emily's chest tightened as memory pushed forward, uninvited but undeniable. A night she had tucked away because it had never belonged anywhere else in her life. She hesitated, but only for a moment, because denying it now felt like trying to hold back something already moving. Yes, she said softly, and the air between them shifted again, the space narrowing in a way that made everything feel closer, more immediate. Alexander took a slow breath, his gaze steady on her, not intense in a way that pressured, but focused in a way that did not leave room for dismissal. There was a storm, he said, and this time it was her turn to feel the certainty in his words, the way they reached into a memory she had not spoken of in years, the rain that had come down in sheets, the cold that had seeped into everything, the moment she had stopped on a quiet street because someone needed help. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against Noah's hand, her mind no longer able to push the past aside, because it was no longer just hers, it was being reflected back at her, piece by piece. You were there, he continued, his voice lower now, not questioning, not accusing, but recognizing, and Emily felt her breath catch as the memory came fully into focus, the man she had helped that night, the one she had never expected to see again, the one she had walked away from because there had been no reason to stay. I did not know who you were, she said quietly, the truth simple but layered with everything that had followed, because that night had not been about names or status, it had been about a moment, a choice, and then it had ended. Alexander nodded once, as if that part did not matter, as if the identity he carried now had nothing to do with what he was remembering, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence filled with the weight of a connection that had existed long before this hospital room, long before Noah, long before either of them understood what it meant. Emily looked back at her son then, at the small boy who had been the center of her world for 5 years, and the realization settled in slowly, not as a shock, but as something deeper, something that reshaped everything quietly but completely, because the past she had kept separate was no longer separate, it was here, standing a few feet away, looking at her with the same steady gaze that had followed her since the moment he walked in, and for the first time, she could not tell herself that it was coincidence anymore, not when every piece was beginning to fall into place in a way that made the truth harder to avoid with each passing second. The memory did not just return, it unfolded slowly, like a door opening that Emily had kept closed for years, revealing details she had chosen not to revisit, the cold rain soaking through her jacket that night, the empty street lit only by flickering streetlights, the sound of distant traffic muted by the storm, and the man she had found leaning against a parked car, disoriented, barely steady on his feet. She had not hesitated then, not because she trusted him, but because she could not walk away from someone who clearly needed help, not when she knew what it felt like to be alone in a moment that mattered. She remembered guiding him to shelter, her hands steady despite the uncertainty, her voice calm even though she had no idea who he was or what had happened before she arrived, and she remembered the way he had looked at her, not with recognition, not with clarity, but with a quiet reliance that had made her stay longer than she had planned. You should have stayed out of it, Alexander said softly now, his voice pulling her back to the present, not as a reprimand, but as an acknowledgement of something he had only come to understand much later, and Emily shook her head slightly, her eyes still on Noah, because that had never been a choice she could make differently. I could not, she replied, her voice just as quiet, because some things were not about logic, they were about who you were when it mattered. The room remained still around them, the weight of the past settling into the present in a way that made everything feel more connected than it had before, and Alexander took a slow step closer, not enough to cross the space she had claimed, but enough to stand within it, his gaze steady, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. That night, he said, And for a moment, it seemed like he might not finish, like the words carried more than he usually allowed himself to express. But then he continued, his voice controlled but lower than before, I never forgot it. And Emily felt something shift again, not outside, but inside, because she had always believed that night had ended when she walked away, that it had not followed either of them beyond that moment. I did, she said honestly, not to dismiss it, but because it had been necessary, because her life had moved forward in a direction that did not leave space for unanswered questions or unfinished connections. Alexander nodded once, not offended, not surprised, as if he understood that completely, and perhaps he did, because his world had likely allowed him to revisit the past differently than hers had. There was a pause then, a quiet stretch of time where either of them spoke, where the reality of what they were beginning to understand settled into something more solid, something that could not be undone by silence anymore. Emily looked annoyed again, at the small boy who had been her reason for everything, and she felt it fully now, not as a question, not as a possibility, but as a truth that had already begun to take shape, because the timing, the memory, the connection, all of it aligned in a way that left very little room for anything else. You think, she started, but the words did not come easily, because saying them would make it real in a way that could not be taken back, and Alexander did not finish the sentence for her, did not push it forward, he simply met her gaze with a quiet certainty that spoke for itself. Emily's breath caught slightly, her hand tightening around Noah's again, not out of fear this time, but out of the weight of realization, because everything she had built, every decision she had made, every moment she had carried alone, was now being seen through a different lens, one that included someone she had never expected to see again. He is my son, she said finally, her voice steady despite everything she was feeling, because that part would never change, no matter what else did, and Alexander did not challenge that, did not argue, only nodded once, his expression softening in a way that had not been there before. I know, he replied quietly, and then, after a brief pause, his voice lower still. But he might be mine too. And the words settled between them, not as a claim this time, not as something to take, but as something to face, together or not, and Emily closed her eyes for just a second, not to escape, but to steady herself, because the truth she had spent years living without was no longer something she could ignore, and whatever came next would not just change the moment, it would change everything that followed after it. Emily did not open her eyes immediately after his words settled into the space between them, because she knew that once she did, there would be no stepping back from what had just been said, no way to return to the version of her life where everything had been defined, controlled, and carried alone. Her fingers remained wrapped gently around Noah's hand, grounding her in the one truth that had never changed, the one thing that did not depend on memory or uncertainty, and she focused on that, on the warmth of his skin, on the steady rise and fall of his chest, because everything else suddenly felt like it was shifting beneath her feet. When she finally looked up, her gaze met Alexander's again. And this time there was no distance left in it, no dismissal, only the quiet recognition that they were standing at the same point now, whether they had intended to or not. You do not get to just appear and change everything, she said softly, her voice not raised, not sharp, but firm in a way that carried years of unspoken weight, because this was not just about a possibility, it was about the life she had built piece by piece without him, about every night she had stayed awake, every decision she had made without support, every moment she had chosen strength because there had been no alternative. Alexander did not interrupt, did not defend himself, his posture steady, his expression composed but no longer distant, and when he spoke, his voice carried something different now, something quieter, more personal. I know, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to deny what she had endured. And I am not here to take that away from you. And the sincerity in his tone made it harder to hold on to anger alone, because he was not dismissing her reality, he was acknowledging it. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the tension shifted, not disappearing, but changing, becoming something she had to face rather than fight. Then what are you here for? She asked, and the question felt heavier than any before it, because it was no longer about understanding the past, it was about defining what came next. Alexander glanced at Noah for a brief moment before answering, and that glance alone carried more meaning than anything else. He could have said, "To do what I should have done," he replied, his voice steady, not claiming, not demanding, but offering something that had not existed before, and Emily felt it, the difference between obligation and intention, between someone stepping in out of duty and someone choosing to stay. She shook her head slightly, not rejecting him entirely, but pushing back against the simplicity of the statement, because nothing about this was simple. "You did not know," she said, her voice softer now, because part of her needed to acknowledge that truth as well, that he had not walked away from something he had been aware of, that the absence had not been intentional in the way she had always feared. Alexander nodded once, accepting that, but not using it as an excuse. "No, I did not," he said, and then, after a brief pause, "But I know now." And the weight of that sentence settled into the room in a way that made it clear he was not going to step back from it, not now that the connection had been made. Emily looked at Noah again, at the small boy who had been her entire world, and she felt the shift fully now, not as something external, but as something internal, because the truth did not change who she was to him, but it did change the space around them, the future she had always imagined for just the two of them. "He is not something you can just step into," she said quietly, her hand tightening slightly around Noah's, because protecting him had always been her first instinct, her first responsibility. "He is everything." And Alexander's expression softened in a way that had not been there before, not as a reaction, but as an understanding. "I can see that," he replied, his voice low, steady, and for the first time, there was no distance left in it, no separation between his world and hers, only a quiet acknowledgement of what truly mattered. The room remained still around them, the soft sounds of the hospital continuing in the background, but everything inside that space had shifted, not into resolution, not into certainty, but into something more real. Something that could not be ignored anymore, and Emily realized that this was no longer about deciding whether he belonged in their lives. It was about understanding what that belonging would mean, and whether she was ready to let that answer unfold, knowing it would change everything that came after it. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore, it felt full, layered with everything that had been said and everything that had not yet found words, and Emily remained where she was, her hand still resting over Noah's, her presence steady even as her thoughts moved through unfamiliar ground. The fluorescent lights above cast a soft, even glow across the room, and for the first time since they had arrived, nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt like it was slipping out of control, only waiting, as if the moment itself was giving her space to decide what it meant. Noah stirred again, his small fingers shifting under hers, and when his eyes opened this time, they were clearer, more aware, and he looked up at her with quiet trust, the kind that did not question, the kind that simply believed she would always be there. Emily smiled softly, brushing her fingers gently through his hair, her voice low and warm as she asked if he was feeling better, and he gave a small nod, his gaze lingering on her for a second before drifting again, this time not uncertain, not searching, but simply curious as it moved toward the man who had not left. Alexander stood a few feet away, not closer than before, not further, his posture unchanged, but something in his expression had softened, something less guarded, less defined by certainty and more by presence, as if he understood that this moment was not about proving anything, but about being there in a way that could be seen. Noah looked between them, his small brow furrowing just slightly, and then, without hesitation, he reached out his free hand, not toward one, but toward both, his fingers extending into the space between them in a gesture so simple it carried more meaning than anything either of them had said. Emily felt it immediately, the quiet weight of that choice, not directed, not influenced, but natural. As if Noah had bridged a distance either of them knew how to close on their own. She hesitated for just a second, her instinct to protect rising again, but it was different now, not a wall, not a barrier, but something softer, something that allowed her to see the moment for what it was rather than what she feared it might become. Alexander noticed it too, the small outstretched hand, and for the first time, he did not move immediately, did not step forward with certainty, but paused, as if understanding that this was not something to claim, not something to take, but something to be given. Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, not as the man who had appeared out of nowhere, not as the possibility she had resisted, but as someone standing at the edge of something that mattered, waiting, not demanding. And in that pause something shifted fully, not outside, but within her, because she realized that this was not about losing what she had built, it was about deciding whether there was room for something more, something that did not erase the past but acknowledged it. Slowly, without breaking her connection with Noah, she allowed her gaze to soften, not in surrender, but in understanding, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Alexander stepped forward then, carefully, deliberately. Not closing the space all at once, but moving just enough to reach the moment without overwhelming it, and when his hand met Noah's, it was gentle, steady, nothing forced, nothing claimed, just contact, simple and real. Noah's fingers curled slightly around both of theirs, holding them in a connection that felt both new and familiar at the same time, and Emily felt it, not as something being taken from her, but as something expanding. Something that did not diminish what she had given, but added to it in a way she had never expected. The room remained quiet, the soft sounds of the hospital continuing in the background, but everything inside that space had changed, not with noise, not with certainty, but with something quieter, something deeper. Emily looked at Noah, then at Alexander, and for the first time, she did not see a stranger standing in her life, she saw a possibility, unfinished, uncertain, but real, and as Noah held on to both of them, she understood something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that being strong had never meant doing everything alone, and that sometimes, the hardest thing was not protecting what you had, but allowing it to grow, because blood might begin a story, but love, patient and chosen, was what decided how it would be told.